Welcome back everyone to Genshin Interact. Our next banner for Fontaine holds two pretty strong reruns, one being the Archon of Geo and possibly the best shielder in the game, Zhongli, and the other being the first playable Harbinger in Tartaglia. Let's go through both of these banners for the second half of 4.0 and see whether or not they're a good pulling option for you.
If you do enjoy the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe and check out the rest of the channel for other videos you may be interested in. We are looking to create a Discord at 1,000 subscribers, so it'd be awesome if you could help us get there. Are the Geo Archon and the 11th Harbinger good pulls for your account, or are they put here to distract you from the Hydra Archon and a possible Harbinger playable in Fontaine?
Now, onto the video. Looking first on the first part of the banner for this second phase of 4.0, we're going to be looking at Zhongli. The Geo Archon, everybody knows him to be probably one of the best shielders in the game, and so let's look at his team function, kind of where he fits into a team. He's going to mainly be a support character. There are people who use him for a physical DPS role, but mainly you're going to want him in this support, shield support, and or burst support character slot just to help him do more damage for the team, I guess, in his burst and, kind of use that petrification he has, but also his shield is a big part. He fits in almost every team just because he's such a great flex character, and, it helps a lot of early game players, not have to worry about too much dodging and whatever and getting used to the mechanics. But besides his team function, Rift, what can you tell us about his actual kit?
Yeah, so looking into his kit, we see that he ascends into Geo damage bonus, so that's kind of nice. His normal attack isn't really anything special, but people who build physical DPS Zhongli, which we'll talk about a little later in the video, you should level this. Otherwise, again, it's not that important. Looking at his skill, the game calls this Dominus Lapidus, and there are two versions. There's a press version, which creates a stone stele, and it's just a Geo construct on the field that lasts for 30 seconds, so it has pretty good uptime there, and it also does AoE Geo damage where it is placed, again for over 30 seconds. Now the hold version of this causes nearby Geo energy to explode, causing the following effects. The first effect states that if their maximum number hasn't been reached, then it will create another stone stele, and the constellations with Zhongli can change this, so that's why it says it this way. But basically, if you have constellation 0, you can only have one out at a time. The second effect from using the hold version of his skill creates a Shield of Jade, and this shield's damage absorption is based on Zhongli's max HP. And then the third effect is, again, this stone stele will just deal AoE Geo damage, much like it does in the press version as well. Basically, the major difference between pressing and holding the skill is that when you hold the skill, not only will you create the stone stele, construct to deal damage, you'll also get an insane shield that scales on Zhongli's max HP. And then looking at the Jade shield from the hold version, specifically this possesses 150% damage absorption against all element and physical damage. And also, characters protected by this Jade Shield will decrease elemental resistance and physical resistance of opponents in a small AoE by 20%. But looking now at his burst, Vixen, what do you have to say about that?
Well, his burst is called Planet Befall. It sends a massive Geo Meteor dealing massive Geo damage to opponents caught in its AoE and applies the petrification status to them. The opponents affected by petrification at this point basically cannot move. One of the passes we want to mention is his second. It states that Zhongli deals more damage based on his max HP. Even if you are going physical Zhongli, it's good to know that HP stat that you may not be building too much into actually does still help you out. Looking beyond his actual kit, Rift, what are some actual characters that are maybe similar to him and that if you have them, you may not need to actually get him if you already have them?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different similar characters that can come to different people's minds, just because when people think of Zhongli, they just think of like a support, shielder support, and that's really all you're doing. And yeah, there are other builds, but that's like the first thing that might come to mind. So a lot of characters one might think of is like Noelle, because she can be a good shielder, and her shield's based off of defense, which also reminds me of Xinyan's shield, that scales off of defense. There's Layla, which hers is HP based, but Cryo could mess up some team synergy, or in some cases can actually help. Also Diona, same thing, she's another Cryo shielder that's based on HP, and again can hurt or help based on the team setup. While there are other shielding characters that we could talk about in the game, some of these that we talked about just kind of are the most similar maybe to Zhongli, especially when talking about Zhongli and kind of seeing their comparison with him.
Looking at the other half of the banner, we look at Tartaglia. And looking at his team function, where he kind of fits in a team, he is an on-field DPS character. Nothing really in his kit is off-field except his Riptide status, which we'll talk about in a minute. but besides that, he's going to want to stay on field for as long as possible and fit really nicely into rotation with off-field benefiting characters. Looking now into his kit, he ascends into Hydro damage bonus, which helps a lot considering, once again, his skill and everything you'll see we're going to be talking about helps him a lot considering he's going to try to keep as much Hydro damage out on the field as much as possible. Now looking into his normal attack, skill, and burst, Rift, what can you tell us about a few of these?
So his normal attack isn't really anything special, but his charge attack does have some cool features. A fully charged aim bow shot will deal Hydro damage and apply the Riptide status. Now, looking into this Riptide status effect, opponents affected by Riptide will take AoE Hydro damage when attacked by Tartaglia in various ways. This damage is considered normal attack damage, and there are two different types of effects that come from the Riptide status. The first one is Riptide Flash, and it states that a fully charged aim shot hitting an opponent affected by Riptide deals consecutive instances of AoE damage. And then the second thing is called Riptide Burst, and it states that defeating an opponent affected by Riptide creates a Hydro Burst that inflicts the Riptide status on nearby opponents. So this will make it, especially for dealing with groups of smaller enemies, it'll kind of just chain effect to the others and can just make the battle pretty fun. He is pretty fun to use, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Now looking into his skill, it is called Foul Legacy Raging Tide. This allows him to change to 2 melee short swords made out of the Hydro element, and this puts him in a melee stance. In this stance, normal and charge attacks are converted to Hydro damage and can't be overridden by any other elemental infusion. This changes his attacks, but also Riptide Flash to Riptide Slash. Riptide Slash states that hitting an opponent affected by Riptide with a melee attack unleashes a Riptide Slash that deals AoE Hydro damage. This damage is considered elemental skill damage, so make sure to level this up considering this is what you're going to mainly be using for his actual damaging instances. The reason why Riptide Flash is changed into Riptide Slash is because we are changing from the aimed shot in Riptide Flash when he's using his bow shot into the Riptide Slash, which is his melee attacks. Riptide Burst, although, does not talk about aim shots or normal attacks with his swords, so you don't have to worry about that changing. Riptide Burst also can happen in his melee stance, which once again we'll go over. Defeating an opponent affected by Riptide creates a Hydro Burst that inflicts the Riptide status on nearby opponents. Therefore, Riptide Burst can work in his aimed mode with his bow, as well as any damage instances you do with his skill and his melee stance. Finally, looking into his melee stance and his cooldown, the longer you are in his melee stance, the longer his cooldown will become. This skill has a very long cooldown of 45 seconds, and this is where playing Tartaglia becomes more difficult, because if you stay in his skill state too long, he gets the longer cooldown, and it could mess up your team's rotation, effectively making this DPS useless for the time being.
Alright, so now looking at his burst is called Havoc Obliteration, and based on his stance, Tartaglia will perform different attacks in his burst. If you are in the ranged stance, then he will swiftly fire a Hydro-imbued magic arrow, dealing AoE Hydro damage and applying the Riptide status to the enemy. When you use this burst in his melee stance, however, he will perform a slash with a large AoE, dealing massive Hydro damage to all surrounding opponents, which triggers Riptide Blast. Now, Riptide Blast states that when the obliterating waters hit an opponent affected by Riptide, it clears their Riptide status and triggers a Hydro Explosion that deals AoE Hydro damage. This damage is considered burst damage. Now, an important passive to mention on Childe is his second passive. This is called Sword of Torrents, and it states that when in his melee stance and dealing a crit hit, normal and charged attacks apply the Riptide status effect to opponents. Knowing this about his second passive, you really want to make sure that you have an ample amount of crit rate on your Tartaglia. Now, as any DPS goes, you want to have a good crit ratio overall, but also keep in mind that with Tartaglia, it is even more important to have a good crit rate.
Looking at similar characters to him, we look at really the only other one, which is the other main Hydro DPS in Ayato. Ayato is an on-field DPS with off-field burst capabilities, so that is something extra that Ayato has over Childe or Tartaglia, so just keep that in mind. They are both, though, very good for vaporized teams, and Ayato is a lot easier to understand and use rather than Childe. You're trying to focus a lot with Tartaglia actually using all of his stuff correctly and looking at all the Riptides and the 3 different statuses along with Riptide itself, how it affects your characters and whatnot. Whereas Ayato is kind of just like press your skill and just hold normal attack. That's really his entire kit. Besides obviously his burst that does help a lot with off-field help if you have a quick swap with another character. If you have Ayato and you're wondering if you need Tartaglia though, You probably don't. Just safe to say to just stick with Ayato. And there are other Hydro characters coming out in the future that may be a little bit better anyways.
Looking at the weapon banner now, we're going to talk about Zhongli and Childe weapons. And first we're going to look at Vortex Vanquisher. Now this polearm has a main stat of 49.6% attack at level 90. And we're going to state all of the abilities assuming it's at Refinement 1. Shield strength will increase by 20%, and scoring hits on opponents increases attack by 4% for 8 seconds. Now this has a max of 5 stacks, so this can essentially you can get 20% more attack. While protected by a shield, this attack increase effect is increased by 100%. So 100% of the maximum 20% that you can get, not an extra 100% attack. So don't confuse that. So just to go over that real quick, you can score hits on opponents to increase your attack by 4%. That stacks 5 times. So now you have essentially up to 20% attack from that. Now, that latter part that says while protected by a shield, you're increasing that by 100%, which means you're just doubling that. So now you're going to get a maximum of 40% attack off of this weapon. So looking at some best characters, obviously, it will be good for Zhongli, and we're going to talk a little bit about some team compositions and how you build your Zhongli can actually determine that this weapon isn't actually his best in slot. If you're going more of a full shield only and that's it, or you're going a hybrid like DPS and shield. But really also Shenhe can use this just because of the high attack, and it really helps her buff that she gives to her party members.
Now looking at the other side of the banner at Polar Star, it has a main stat of 33.1% crit rate at level 90, and once again we will be looking at these abilities at Refinement 1. The skill and burst damage are increased by 12%. After a normal attack, charge attack, elemental skill, or elemental burst hits an opponent, the equipping character will receive 1 Ashen Night Star for 12 seconds. 1, 2, 3, and 4 stacks of Ashen Night Star give 10, 20, 30, and 48% attack respectively on each one. This is going to be great as well to help certain characters, so let's look at the certain characters that this weapon is going to be best for. First, obviously, we're going to look at Tartaglia, as it is his weapon. The attack buff is going to help, as well as the skill and burst damage. Every part of this is going to help him, as well as the main set of crit rates going to help that passive that we were talking about earlier. Yoimiya is another character that could use it. The crit rate could be well, as she could focus on some crit damage on her other stats, as well as the attack in general that's given from those Ashen Night Star stacks could just help in general you focus on other things that you can maybe look for in her actual kit to get more damage off of her. Gon used it very similar way. And even some character like Fischl, who can use every bit of this as well. If you're going a little bit more of a damage way for Fischl, if you already have enough energy recharge, or maybe even if you're not using her for her burst and you're actually just looking for her to be your main DPS, you can actually use this as well in this instance. So just make sure to kind of keep these characters in mind in Tartaglia, Yoimiya, Ganyu, and Fischl, as they can use a lot of these different areas that this weapon could help them. Now we're going to look into the pulling options and a lot of the different questions we like to look at to actually help people understand whether or not they need the characters that are on the banners.
Okay, so the first question we like to ask is, do you need either of these characters on your account? And so looking at Zhongli, between Zhongli and Kazuha, as these two are the best characters if you need a flex character in your teams and whatnot, Zhongli is amazing with his shielding and gives buffs while shielding, and Kazuha gives buffs to teammates as well. Now, need for Zhongli is becoming less and less prevalent in the game as more and more characters are getting pretty good shields. Characters like Noelle and Layla are very good at shielding and don't need a lot of effort to make them good. On the other hand, Childe, first and foremost, he's not a bad character at all. His damage is crazy and consistent, and he still is definitely up there on the list for good DPSs in the game. But there is a learning curve to understanding him and how to use him. Similar to a character kind of like Alhaitham, who needs the player to focus on his mirrors to maximize his damage, Tartaglia needs the player to always be checking how long he's in his melee stance to make the rotation smoother. Again, very good damage, just a high learning curve, but again, he's not necessary for any account. With new Hydro characters in the area of Fontaine in general, it might be best to wait and see what Fontaine brings before you pull him.
The next question we look at is, what elements is your account in need of? Geo is not a necessity on your account in this regard, and we'll talk about why in a second, exactly why Zhongli is not maybe great for it, but Geo has kind of fallen off the meta right now, and a lot of the things that are going on with that, but more importantly, going back to that first part I was talking about, Zhongli isn't crazy with his amount of Geo that he mainly gives out. His skill and his construct that go out on field put out a little bit of Geo damage and a certain small AoE, but if you're away from that Geo construct, it doesn't really help you. And then his burst gives it, as well as he's doing a huge petrification on characters, and that's maybe a one-time instance, and that you can maybe pick up for shields, but besides that, his constant Geo really isn't prevalent. So going for Zhongli, it's a little bit more focused on getting him because of his role and his shield, rather than looking at his element. Tartaglia, on the other hand, is great if you need a Hydro character. His skills, melee stance, and burst allow you to focus on Hydro and to be a constant with that Hydro on the team. Although he fares well here, if you're looking for a great Hydro DPS, my thoughts personally would be to wait for a new Verlet or to go after an Ayato rerun.
The third question we look at is, do you have the resources to properly invest into the character you pull? You know, both using the Liyue materials, it should not be too hard to get to Liyue and farm for their necessary materials to upgrade them. I know that Tartaglia takes the little conchs, or like the seashell looking items, and you can find those all over the Yaoguang Shoals, I believe it's called, and some of the beaches south of that. And then Zhongli, again, he's more Liyue materials, and I'll also have those on screen. So it shouldn't be too hard. If you're a completely new player, like you just started last week, you're probably already really close to being in Liyue, if not already there.
Another question is, what kinds of teams are you trying to build? Zhongli's kind of a one-size-fits-all type character where he fits on practically any team. He is going to be a very big flex character, very much like Kazuha, and this is kind of the character that you throw in at the very end when your other three characters are already very well built and already have a reaction kind of going on and don't need the fourth character to make that reaction. Zhongli will help to obviously protect the characters and make sure that they're doing as much as they possibly can while staying on field and not having to worry about a healer or whatnot if you don't have one in the other three characters. On the other hand, Tartaglia does best on a Vaporize and a Melt team. His freeze teams do not do too well, but he can still put out decent numbers, but just make sure that if you are going for Tartaglia, he does do his best on those Vaporize and Melt teams to just help his damage multiply more on those reactions.
The next question we look at is, looking at your account, what roles do you have filled or not filled? Now, Zhongli is a shielding support, so he's going to be a great shielder in flex slot, and if you've built him right, he can actually put out a crazy ton of damage if you happen to have something like a Staff of Homa lying around, because that's going to give him a lot of HP, which is helping his shield, and then also as a crit damage main stat, just really makes him easy to put out a lot of damage with his burst. And looking at Tartaglia, once again, he's a great Hydro DPS.
Our next section we like to talk about is weighing the dangers from, new free-to-play players that have just started the game, looking into the veteran free-to-play players, as well as the people who put a little bit of money into the game, all the way to the very end where people put a lot of money into the game. And just looking at how each instance, what these characters can do for you, or if you need to pull them or not. First, looking at free-to-play players and maybe the very beginner players, even if you spend a little money, you do want to focus on characters that slot into a lot of different teams. That is really going to help make the beginning of the game very easy and a lot easier for you before the actual late game kicks in, help you understand a lot of the mechanics that are going on in the game. Zhongli is definitely one of those characters that early game players would need. As one of the best characters in the game, it's not a bad idea to go after the Geo Archon, but just remember you could miss out on the Hydro Archon because of it. Tartaglia might be a bit harder to use for beginner players, but free-to-play players, if you've been here for a while and want him, shouldn't really have a problem at all, because you should maybe just understand him a little bit better, and you probably already have a good place to put him with your other characters that you've gained over time.
So now looking at veteran spenders and veteran free-to-play players, you should already have a decent lineup on your account by now, and possibly 2 4-person teams for the Spiral Abyss at this point. If you don't have Zhongli or Kazuha as a flex character on your account that can help with either more sustainability or more buffing for damage, you might think about getting Zhongli or waiting for a Kazuha rerun. Especially just because you might already have a lot of characters that can do a lot of good damage, you have a lot of good supports to support those on-field DPSs you have. Now getting some S-tier kind of flex characters like Zhongli or Kazuha can really help you out. Tartaglia is a character that might interest many of you veteran players since your lineup has grown and you can start looking at more characters to fit roles you already have.
Well, looking at high spenders, at this point, you're already going to be looking at the characters themselves, and maybe you already have both of these characters as they've been around for a very long time, and so now you're maybe looking at some constellations. As a general rule, as we've talked about before, most good constellations, other than the actual C6 that are mostly usually the best. Of course, we need to look at the C1 and C2 for a majority of characters. Looking now at Zhongli's constellations, besides his healing 6th constellation that really kind of helps out, his second constellation grants nearby characters on the field the Jade Shield when his burst descends. Another avenue for protection while using damage could smooth out a rotation with him very nicely, as if you're using the burst you don't have to take the time to use his skill with his shield getting it out. Looking at Tartaglia on the other hand, his 6th constellation is very good since it resets his skill's cooldown if you use the burst while in his melee stance. but looking at other constellations before that, his second best might be his first constellation, which is pretty good, saving some primos. This is because it decreases the cooldown of his skill by 20%. This is great since it really could make his rotation on a team a lot smoother and play in his melee stance longer. The last question we're going to look at is, do you need the weapons? Both weapons aren't really necessary, and Vortex Vanquisher might even be the best for like Shenhe rather than Zhongli. Zhongli really likes Staff of Homa more anyways, so this weapon is probably, and we're talking about Vortex Vanquisher here, Vortex Vanquisher is probably one of the worst 5-star weapons in my own opinion anyways, considering it's not really that great for the actual character, and it doesn't really help any other character besides Shenhe. And nothing against Shenhe, but if you're going after Shenhe for her own 5-star weapon, you might as well just go for her own 5-star weapon than rather trying to go after Vortex Vanquisher. Now looking at Polar Star, when we're looking at a great weapon with a great ability, but Tartaglia is really the only one that prefers it over other personal 5-star weapons. Even though we talked about Yoimiya and how she would like this weapon, she would rather obviously use her own weapon in Thundering Pulse, her personal 5-star weapon. Ganyu is more inclined to use Hunter's Path and Amos's bow, but she does favor Polar Star on a freeze team, so just keep that in mind if you want to use it.
We hope that this video could help you decide on whether these characters or weapons coming up on the next banner are for you.
As always, if you have any suggestions that may help other players, go ahead and let us know down in the comments. Thank you again for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next one.